This is week one of the Podcast VA Internship Program, and in this week, we're going to go through podcast setup. Now, this week is going to be super easy, hopefully, and it'll be very quick to get through. So, in this presentation, I'm talking about podcast setup, and then we'll do a breakdown of the assignments that you have for week one. For podcast setup, we're talking first about podcast hosting and then about the RSS feed, which is a key part of podcast setups. Now, podcast hosting, you need to be aware of for your own podcast or when you're helping other clients with their podcast because they may come in. You might have some clients who come in with their own podcast already on a platform, and then you might have some clients who come in asking, what platforms should they be on. Now, depending on what the client wants to do with their podcast in the future, you might recommend that they do a free versus paid podcast hosting site. So there are free options that are mentioned here: Acast, Anchor, and self-hosted. I don't recommend self-hosted unless you're very familiar with RSS feeds and how to set it up so that you can use it to distribute your podcast to different podcast sites, which we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. But if you are familiar with self-hosting, it just means that the podcast episodes will be on the client's or your own website, and then you would distribute that to those podcast sites from your own platform. Now, I don't recommend self-hosting them, like I said, unless you're very tech savvy and you know how to do that yourself. When you have it on one of these sites that are mentioned here or recommended here, they create the RSS feed for you. And in some cases, they would submit it for you, or you would submit it to yourself to places like iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, like all the different podcast platforms that you can submit your podcast to. There are paid options here, but if your client is not somebody that wants to maybe in the future monetize their podcast, or they're just thinking of it as like a side hobby or a side hustle, um, I wouldn't recommend that they move to paid. But if they are adamant about being on the paid platform, here are some recommendations here, which are Buzzsprout, Podbean, and Libsyn. As part of this internship, you will be setting up your podcast on a free site. If you want to go for a paid site, that's completely up to you, but I recommend starting with a free site, and you get the experience of setting it up on one of these sites so that if you run into issues with your own clients, you've already been through that experience, so you know what to expect and you know what you're looking for. That's a big part of the internship program, is you're going to be doing a lot of these tasks for yourself so that you get in the habit or get the idea of what is involved in certain tasks when you are taking on client work. So now let's talk about RSS feeds. According to Wistia, the RSS feed, the official definition is when a podcast episode is published, that information is added to the RSS feed. And the RSS feed is responsible for sharing and distributing that content to certain platforms. Your RSS feed contains your show title, information you've added about your show, and episode details. And that goes to the different platforms in like an XML file. You can research what some RSS feeds look like, so you can get examples of what an RSS feed file looks like. But when you set up your platform, you'll see what it is. You'll see what it is when you set up your own podcast. Here's an example of what the URL might look like for your RSS feed. But you will see that once you get into the actual assignment for this week, which is setting up your podcast. Now, week one is about podcast setup. And the first thing that I want you to do as part of your assignment is decide on your podcast concept. So as part of this program, what's the podcast, the limited series podcast that you want to develop? So you'll be coming up with your podcast name, your podcast summary, which can be 2 or more sentences, and your first 5 episodes. Now, do not spend a lot of time in this area because, like I mentioned, if you don't want to share this podcast with anybody else, you don't have to. The only person that you're sharing this podcast with is myself. And whoever you want to share it to as your personal end, but you do not ever have to share this podcast out to the world if you don't want to. So do not spend a lot of time thinking, oh gosh, I can't think of my podcast name, or gosh, I can't think of what my first 5 episodes would be on my limited series podcast. Here are some examples of episodes that you can come up with for your podcast to make it easier for you. So episode 1, you can do something like a meet the host episode. I recommend this for my clients who I start with from the very beginning. So if they're still thinking about what they want their episodes to be, I always recommend that they do a meet the host episode, because as you'll learn with some platforms, you do not get your RSS feed URL until you have at least one episode published. So if they can create something like a meet the host episode, because they're just talking about themselves, right? And talking about what they want their podcast to be, you can have them really do that really quickly and then upload it to the website or upload it to your podcast host, and then you'll get that RSS feed. I can't remember which ones are the ones that don't give you it until you have at least one episode published. But some podcast hosts do not give you an RSS feed until you have at least one episode published. So I recommend that you do like a episode 1 meet the host if you want to do that, or you can do an episode trailer, which I'll add as bonus content, talking about episode trailers and what you can do there. But continuing with this sample 5-episode arc, episode 1 will be about meet the host. Episode 2 could be about why you want to be a podcast intern. Episode 3 can be about what do you like about podcasts. Episode 4, your top 5 podcasts that you listen to. And episode 5, if you were to start a podcast show, what would it be about, or who would it be for? Now, these do not have to be super long episodes. You're the one that's going to be recording these episodes as we get to the audio editing version of this internship program. These do not have to be very super long episodes. You have some people who create podcasts that are 5 minutes long, 10 minutes long. So don't think about, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to fill up the time. It's not about filling up the time. It's just about getting that experience. So this is one example, and then here's another one. This is a 5-episode arc where you talk about meet the host. Episode 2 could be about podcast management, why you want to pursue podcast management. Episode 3 could be about podcast services. Episode 4 could be about who do you want to work with as your podcast client. And episode 5, what's next for you. And this episode sample, I recommend, because if you want to create your own podcast portfolio, or if you want to give like potential clients something to listen to as far as why you're a podcast VA or why they should hire you, you have like a whole episode arc here that they can listen to your 5 episodes, learn more about you, learn more about the services that you're offering. And you can use it as a marketing tool for your business. So it's up to you which 5 episodes that you want to do. You can use any of the samples here, or you can create your own if you were already thinking about starting a podcast. Completely up to you what you want your 5 episodes to be, but that's the assignment. Now, after you've completed your podcast concept, the next part of your assignment is actually setting it up on the podcast host. Now, if you've done the pre-work already for this internship program, you would have already set up your podcast on a hosting platform. So I want you to log into that host and plug in the information that you developed when you created your podcast concept. And that is going to be it for this week. If you have questions, drop them into the week 1 area in Asana, and I will address them. Make sure you tag me, and I'll address them as you have questions that come up. If you run into any issues as you are doing the assignments, let me know. And again, detail what the issues are that you're running into and drop them into the Asana area. We won't start our feedback sessions until next week, just because we're a little bit behind the wheel as far as starting, but we'll schedule them out starting next week, and that will depend on whether or not you have questions. If there are no questions for the week, then I won't schedule a session, but if there are questions, then we'll schedule sessions for Fridays. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you in the next lesson.